Speaking of paper, this is work in progress. This is new material. So I'm more than grateful for comments and critique later in the Q&A or even beyond that. So my talk is titled On the Concept of History, in parentheses, in Foundation Models. And I want to clarify what I mean by concept of history and what I mean by foundation models. And I will try to do this more or less in order. I will start with Walter Benjamin. So in 1940, German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, before fleeing France towards Spain and eventually committing suicide, Walter Benjamin wrote a short aphoristic text known in English as Thesis on the Philosophy of History. Now, the word philosophy, mind you, is not even in the original title, which is über den Begriff der Geschichte. The overloaded German term Begriff, despite being a core concept of German idealism, has strong material connotations, which are raised by the use of thesis and the reference to philosophy. And Benjamin's goal in the thesis is indeed literal Begriffsarbeit, so laboriously carving out what an established concept could mean, given the radically changing political conditions under which he is writing. And later translations actually use On the Concept of History as the title. In the text, Benjamin proposes a new, quite idiosyncratic materialist concept of history. Fundamentally for him, history is made, manufactured even, and it's not something to be discovered. To articulate the past historically, he writes, does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. So history only comes into existence where the present is contested, where the past becomes relevant for the present. History is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous, empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now. And this presence of the now, Jetztzeit, as Benjamin writes in the original German, is not present, it's not the present, sorry, but something else, a moment of immediacy. The true picture of the past flits by. And we can find that same moment of immediacy in Benjamin's other widely read text on the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility, which is from 1936. The political potential of film, then a new and newly politicized medium, Benjamin argues, derives from its potential to produce abrupt cuts, shock the viewer into a different mode of thinking. In other words, the condition under which history becomes possible, the moment of danger, is the condition that film emulates. In both cases, awareness and insight depend on this moment of immediacy. And in both cases, the moment of immediacy must be actively captured and repurposed for a progressive agenda. And for Benjamin, that means a Marxist agenda, before it falls into the hands of the fascists. There's thus for Benjamin a relation between history as something more than just facts about the past world and the specific ways in which technology mediates our experience of the present world. Crucially, history manifests itself in technology, film for Benjamin, not as a theme, but as a specific way of seeing. And in the framework of Benjamin's thought, we can thus ask, what is the relation between history and technology today? What concept of history does today's technology imply, intentionally or unintentionally? Now, so far, you've likely heard all of this before if you spent like more than 5 minutes with a humanities scholar in a room together. So let me emphasize that I'm interested not only in the context of this workshop, but also in my work in general, in a specific version of this question. And this version is, if we understand computer vision, so using machine learning to look at the world, as a new way of seeing, as a new medium, if you will, much like film in the 1930s, what is the concept, or what are the concepts of history inherent in, or rather produced by, this way of seeing, by computer vision, more specifically by a concrete class of relatively recent computer vision models? And there's, that means it's time to address the second important concept in the title of my talk. So what do I mean when I say foundation models? Foundation model, you might be familiar with this, is a term introduced by a collective of researchers at Stanford in 2021. The paper is called On the Opportunities and Risks of Foundation Models. And foundation model basically just means models that are A, very large, and B, that can be used for a variety of downstream tasks. For instance, question answering and text summarization are usually considered distinctive problems in natural language processing. But GPT-3, the large language model released by OpenAI in 2020, can do both, and it can do also many other things. In the visual domain, which is the domain I'm interested in, the recently released DALL-E 2 model has the capability to generate arbitrary photorealistic images from natural language prompts, such as my title slide, which is reproduced here on the left. And the prompt for that is an IT guy trying to fix the hardware of a PC tower is being tangled by the PC cables like Laocoon, marble copy after Hellenistic original from about 200 BC. And this is the result that you get. DALL-E 2 can, again, also do other things. It can do in-painting, so you cut out a part of an image and then you let it replace this part of the image. And unsurprisingly, DALL-E 2 does terribly at generating the concept of history as a prompt and gives you these like awful inspirational signs spelling hitsy hasty for some reason. Now, usually when people talk about the opportunities and risks of foundation models, to quote the original paper, they talk about either of these models or Google's versions of these models, which are Lambda and ImageGen, respectively. But I want to talk first today about a different model, which has received much less positive or negative press, which I think has much more to say in a way about history than other models. And this model is called CLIP, allegedly short for contrastive language image pre-training. And it was released together with the first version of DALL-E, again by OpenAI in 2021. And by the way, when I say CLIP, I mean the pre-trained model. So literally the binary blob released by OpenAI, and not the architecture that we can generate this pre-trained model from. Foundation models are famously impossible to replicate, which is a whole other issue. So the political economy, so to speak, of pre-trained models is something I'm also interested in. So CLIP is a multimodal model, which means that it projects images and text into a common embedding space. So basically, CLIP learns from images in context. For instance, if you visit a website, any image on a website will usually be accompanied by text. So this could be an image caption, an alt text, which describes the image in case it's not loaded properly and to accommodate people with screen readers, or simply a news article that the image illustrates. A fully trained CLIP model then consists of a high-dimensional vector space, or embedding space, or latent space, it's all the same things, in which words and images that are related are close together. Similarity, in other words, is encoded, is modeled as spatial proximity. And this is true for all embedding models, right? So be it just words, images and words, or just images. And there's one more brief technical aspect that I want to mention, which is that CLIP is actually used in the DALL-E training process as a kind of advanced perceptual loss. So it kind of like judges the quality of the generated images. So they are at least partially related and partially depend on each other. All of this means that CLIP, while it was designed to do image labeling, can also facilitate what computer scientists call image retrieval. So finding specific images within an unlabeled corpus of images based on visual or textual prompts. So basically you can give it an image or you can give it a prompt like DALL-E, and CLIP will find the image closest to the prompt or to the image that you gave in a corpus of unrelated images and unlabeled images, importantly. And so we can ask it basically for things, for images, in terms of other specific collections of images that are independent of the training data used to train the model. For instance, even if there are obviously no Apple MacBooks in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and this, the examples are generated with a system that I built as part of a collaborative project with a German university, Marburg University, and the art historical image archive that they have there. So we used 350,000 images from the Metropolitan collection as kind of like their data. So even if there's no MacBooks in there, we can still ask CLIP to give us the visually closest thing to a MacBook in the collection. And what we get is a coin, that's on the right here, photographed on a, well, I guess it's a space gray, to use Apple's terms, a space gray background positioned in a way that makes the whole image similar in a strange way to a MacBook, without the object in question, a MacBook, actually being in the image. Another example on the left, there are obviously no images of algorithms in the Metropolitan Museum collection. What would that even be, right? Pictures of code, or what would it be? But one result of searching for algorithm is this piece here on the left, where a broken image file, a glitched out image, appears in the publicly visible collection. So this is actually on the Metropolitan website. It's just a mistake in the file format. Let me show you one more example of these strange correspondences that you can have. So Diego Velázquez's 1656 painting, Las Meninas, is certainly the most analyzed painting in the history of art. So Michel Foucault famously spends like the whole introduction to The Order of Things on talking about Las Meninas. W.J.T. Mitchell has a whole chapter in the Meta Pictures book, and there's much more scholarship. And the painting is famous in particular for its play on representation. So the painter himself is in the painting, but we do not see what he's painting, or do we? Because we're actually looking at the painting. There's also a mirroring things in image space. There are countless interesting gaze relations between the protagonists, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, going back to generative models, if we ask DALL-E 2 to produce Las Meninas for us, we just get the image on the left here, a weird like folk art style image of women sitting in a circle, even slightly racist, I would say, given that the prompt is Spanish. On the other hand, if we ask Clip to find the work in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, this is another data set of 70,000 images that we indexed. If you ask Clip to find it, and obviously it's not in their collection, right? It's at the Prado in Madrid, we get this photograph by Roberto Snow on the right, a work that clearly picks up on the same themes as Las Meninas, especially the question of the gaze relation between people in and people before the image, to use Georges Didier Übermann's term. Now, let me backtrack a little bit at this point. I'm not suggesting that one model is better than the other, that one model is more interpretable than the other, that either model's representational structure is better aligned with our own human ways of looking at the world. In fact, picking up on our discussion of interpretability yesterday, I would argue that foundation models are so inaccessible at the moment, not because of their technical opacity, but because they cannot be replicated and are confined behind for-profit APIs, that we have to take any kind of like independent evaluation of their capabilities, including this one, with a grain of salt. What I am suggesting is that we are looking for if we are looking for what remains of humanity, of the human way of doing things in large-scale machine learning models, the context of our inquiry matters. In the case of DALL-E and Clip, that means that the questions that fields like art history and visual studies ask become relevant technically. They inform not a high-level hermeneutical analysis, but a technical close reading of machine learning models. In other words, not unlike in Benjamin, it matters from where we look at the past. The past, in this case, is the training data solidified in a pre-trained model like Clip or DALL-E. But much unlike Benjamin, while we can get a better look at this past data, if we juxtapose it with present data, for instance, with another image collection, we can never reclaim it for the present. We can never render it into history. Because in foundation models, or at least in the image models that I'm interested in, the past is irreversibly marked as the past. This has to do with the entanglement of style and content in these models. A trivial example is that the prompt, a cat driving a car, will only actually make the cat drive the car in a comic world and not in a photorealistic setting. A more interesting example is the inability of models like DALL-E, and here I had to use DALL-E Mini because there's very restrictive content policies that OpenAI enacts on the full version. The inability of models like DALL-E to generate color photos of fascism, as fascism is eternally marked as history. Even adding keywords like 2020 does not help here, and you can actually see how hard the model is trying, right? To kind of conform to the prompt that it should be color images, but it's really failing at that. So let me again briefly backtrack a little bit. I'm not suggesting that these issues cannot possibly be solved technically. Machine learning people have a great track record of finding ways to disentangle representations, for instance, in the case of previous generations of generative models like GANs. And I'm sure there's a way to solve this, right, for the current generation of models. But this, I think, does not take away from the insight that for machine learning systems, history is a hard problem. That things can be temporally so far removed from each other that they absolutely do not look the same, but at the same time be connected to a point where it almost does look like history repeats itself, is something that cannot be taught to machines that rely on an understanding of similarity that is exclusively one of spatial distance. I would just like to end with maybe like a plea for more model specificity and context specificity in critical AI studies and related disciplines. While we might not need a field called CLIP studies yet, we are, I think, at an inflection point where specific and thus historical critiques of specific and thus historical models might tell us more about the place of humanity in an ever-growing ecosystem of technical concreteness than general critiques of AI as a technology. But I would be happy to discuss this with you in the Q&A and later. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much for two really fascinating papers about the realities that computers can't see, they measure instead. And Fabian, also apologies for announcing the title of your presentation incorrectly and dragging you from Benjamin to Fukuyama, which is a real accident. Yeah, questions, Connor, Sonia, yeah, I'll go the mic for you.
Thank you both so much for fantastic papers, a brilliant way to end the formal presentations of our workshop. Fabian, I have a question gestating for you that I haven't formed yet, and we'll discuss it at another time, but fantastic. Tal, I've had the benefit of talking to you before, and so have thought a little bit more about your presentation, which I really enjoyed and thought was great. I'm thinking about how, in what ways the newness of what you're describing is really new. Because I perceived other historical antecedents in a slightly different register maybe. And so I'm thinking about Bernard Harcourt's work, who I might have mentioned to you in the past, who wrote an article called Risk as Proxy for Race and a book called Against Prediction. And he's at Columbia Law School and he's working with a kind of different literature base, but I think it's really instructive. He was sort of rereading Foucault publicly, I think, in a group setting, which was a really interesting project. But that brought up really interesting commentaries on Foucault's work in Society Must Be Defended and elsewhere on this same process, right, of the determination of a political community. So Foucault links it to racism, right? There's a sort of the biopolitical moment is the moment in which racism becomes this way of distinguishing the normal from the abnormal. So I was thinking about what you're doing, and famously Foucault's methodology is said to not see things. It has no vision in it, but it has visibility. So there's sort of epistemological visibility. And so it struck me that although your language is kind of different, the process you're talking about and what's new about this sort of datification or AIification of this is kind of tells a really interesting story about the way in which this sort of political community is being produced. Similarly to the biopolitical turn that Foucault talks about, but in a really unhinged, free-floating way that isn't as tied. So I wondered what it is that's becoming invisible here. And it could be that it's a power strategy of turning that exclusionary tactic into something that's far less tangible, far less seeable, far less accessible. And so, yeah, there's a sort of alternative historicization there, which puts your work in conversation with that older sort of process of producing political communities in a particular way. And then conversely to that, you think, well, also, it also means your end questions are brilliant. Like, how do we work with this? And at the same time, it gives a job to subjects. So we can now actually interact with this through these technologies. So it's this sort of really, I mean, in a way, it's a comment, but also a provocation, to historicize this in terms of the history of biopolitics and the relation between visibility, invisibility, and what work subjects can actually do on that. And I think it's not simply a hiding or an intensification or a worsening, but also giving a capacity to subjects to work on this as you are. And thank you.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. No, thank you so much. I suppose a lot of this has to do with the disciplines that I'm coming from, in particular media studies, cultural studies, I think has like an extreme sort of fetishization for representation and the image, and studying bodies through sort of like, whether subjects are there or not, or if they are there, how are they figured, and so on. And in sort of folks like Lisa Nakamura, for instance, who writes on digitizing race, explicitly visual methods, which part of the project that I'm trying to put forward is, if you're going to be in this disciplines to grasp race today, you need to go beyond sort of visual methods. They're no longer sufficient. But I do think you're right, like other disciplines have had grasped that in a much better way. To the point of sort of newness, I mean, one thing that's been totally fascinating throughout the conversation in the last few days is phrases like feature extraction. Feature extraction is a mode of like knowing the body. The newness, like that the body itself is like now completely fragmented, that the subject is no longer like a singular subject, that they're like just fractured across systems and processes. And in a moment you could be classified as racialized, in another moment you couldn't be. That is like quite new, I think. And that, the idea that it's this interesting reversal of things, like historically, it's like the body determines the pattern. We take sort of genomic, phenotypical or genotypical aspects of the body and we sort of extract out from that. And that is like a really racist form of conceptualizing a person, to be like, well, your skin looks this way, so you have these particular traits. You're like Asian, you're good at maths or whatever, right? The body determines the pattern. And now we're in a different moment in which the pattern is determining the body. Like the behavioral patterns are themselves like unhinged from the body in really strange and unusual ways. So the Facebook ethnic affinities thing, Facebook were like, we don't do race. This isn't race, despite like being like prototypical categories of like almost like medical categories of race, US Hispanic, Asian American, African American, because they are decoupling like race from the body, race from biology, which, in cultural studies is like, yeah, race isn't purely biological, but now like biology has a lot more to say about race because of like epigenetics and so on. But I think that's like a really interesting turn and like something to grasp, because to say sit within a racial category that has no relation to your body is like fascinating to me. And then the idea that you can like shift in and out such that like you can't evidence your race, like a racist thing that has happened to you, because they're like, today you are in this category, but tomorrow you're not, is like, what do we do in terms of evidencing like historic injustice then?
Thanks. I have more to talk to you about.
So my question is for you as well, and it may be basic or naive, but what I was trying to understand, so with the Facebook example, you have the categories of the Hispanic, African American, and Asian, and also with the analogy of the redlining, it's my understanding that was pretty intentional, like we don't want dark colored people living in this neighborhood. But are you differentiating between when there is an intention to try to target, like I want to target Hispanics, I want to not have Hispanics or whatever, look at this type of ad? Or is it, and do you differentiate between that in your work and when there's an unintended development of this ethnic type of typing? Can you comment on when it's intentional and unintentional and how your work relates to that, if that category even makes sense?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is something I do need to sort of like think through a bit more. What is interesting to me is the ways in which like even when people like computer scientists and so on are trying to make these things like not racist, really trying really hard, like these models they just constantly reproduce racism, because everything in like a settler colonial context is a proxy for race. Like this sort of like race that emerges even when you don't want it to do so. Like we're supposed to be in this like post-marketing turn in which produces a post like racial order. So like being Asian American is supposed to be less important than being like interested in cupcakes or interested in like yoga related content. That's like verbatim categories that Facebook uses to advertise the machine learning techniques to say like, we don't do like just basic stuff, blunt demographics like race anymore. We use much more sophisticated techniques to produce something like that. But, obviously interested in yoga related content, kind of racialized, is a proxy for reading whiteness is what I'm saying. So, yeah, it's like even, it's this like, it's the fantasy of being post-race, and yet race nevertheless being reconstituted constantly, but being reconstituted through epiphenomena, like, as an epiphenomena. in ways that are completely unintended and yet reproduce racism nonetheless.
Thank you so much, Tao. I feel like my question is picking up themes from Connell and Sonia's question too. So maybe just more of the same, but this moment when you were talking about like the epistemological break, and you sort of answered this in your response to Connell, like you're coming from sort of a particular discipline that is quite concerned with or sort of focused on visual representation. But, something I think a lot in terms of the legal literature around this stuff is the epistemology of social construction more generally. So whether or not you see the epistemological break as applying to sort of the visual formulations as opposed to data formations, like is the epistemological break happening there? Or do you think it applies more generally to sort of social construction, the epistemologies of social construction? Because your answer to Sonia almost implied a little bit that you do think there's something there, that there's this kind of like, 1 minute I'm raced, 1 minute I'm not. That's very disorienting. How am I supposed to understand that? That might actually go to the more general kind of social construction epistemology, where again, sort of racial subordination is structured as a sort of an enduring logic of subordination in terms of how we are constructed in our web of social relations that sort of makes up social reality. And I guess kind of connected to that, your reflection on feature extraction I thought was so interesting, because I think my experience as a legal scholar is that feature extraction becomes this moment of discovery of the construction of subordination. So you like think you're just doing a thing like, oh, we're just subsidizing mortgages on the basis of home insurance rates. We've extracted a feature. We don't on it a priori on its surface, not a race feature. Once it's enacted in the world, you have that moment of social, you've like rediscovered what racism is, which is living in a world where social subordination is reliably sort of recreating relations of subordination on the basis of race, even when you've sort of extracted that feature. And so from a legal perspective, I think of that moment of feature extraction and then the failure, because you're like, once again, we're doing racism. That's like the discovery of living in a maybe of not having escaped the social construction moment. So anyway, that's just like a lot out there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually was reading Marion Foucault and Kieran Healy's classification situations the other day, which I think is a really brilliant article, and it's really like doing amazing work to kind of describe the phenomena where you're talking about, which is like the redistribution of, not redistribution, but the recapitulation of social orders by, this, and they're reading it through credit, the assignment of credit, and how that play. And they explicitly are talking about class and how class is now recapitulated through these classification situations that place people in relation to life chances. And I think life chances is like a really brilliant terminology to describe what racism is. Like that, it's like, a lot of Black feminist scholars have described like racism as the condition of like being closer to death, like a necropolitical construction of that. And one thing that we might be able to do as scholars of, say, critical race, humanities scholars, is to look at the orders that are being produced and how does that help us to reconstruct, like, to re-articulate what the condition of racism is, such that race isn't just some like biological fact of the body, or like, which in cultural studies is like, because race is, your racial identity is a point of solidarity and a point of pride, and you like are able to like produce cultural media that is a part of your identity and so forth, but also to be able to articulate like race is the marking of the body closer to death, and that's what makes it pernicious.
Thanks so much. Sorry, we have a couple for. Did machine learning people still call feature extraction the production of representations? Is that still, anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, I think probably making a comment that's not too dissimilar to what's already been said, but I think the thing that strikes me as well is that, I guess I wonder about the situatedness of the observations that you're making, and this is actually for both speakers in this respect, because you're both in different registers, situating yourselves as politically engaged observers. And from that perspective, the epistemology of anti-racism or anti-fascism, has to be included, in the observations that we're making. And in that sense, that's the only way that we can keep seeing how race is constructed differently and can be deconstructed and must be deconstructed. And the other thing, of course, it does that is going on with a lot of these algorithmic systems and in racial terms isn't just that we're not, when we think about law, right? And we think like law has a kind of direct discrimination that's easy to map onto a category that's prohibited. Indirect discrimination is this kind of second order effect, but it always refers back to this idea that there's a neutral subjectivity, right? That just will exist. And of course, one of the important things about anti-racism observation is that we see that it's not just about the construction of a negation, but also the positive reification of whiteness, which is another side to what goes on in these things. So the valorization of certain factors as well goes on in this, and we can see that as a production of whiteness. So in that sense, I'd say maybe there's no epistemological break in the anti-racist critique. It's just that can't be taken for granted. And of course, the problem with that is that you situate yourself as a political observer, which means you get political resistance. But if we don't do it, we just see what happens, right? If it just is allowed to be sort of automated or left to the market. So that's just a comment, really. But I would say, maybe think of it as like you're actually repeating a really important epistemology that doesn't speak for itself. Yeah.
Maybe Fabian, do you want to take an opportunity to respond to that comment, and maybe some of the others?
Sure. Very briefly, maybe I think in the case of at least the models that I'm looking in my research, I think the epistemic is inherently political. It really is, because not only in that way that it's a political as a kind of like critique where you find out stuff and then you consider the political implications, but especially in this moment of foundation models is basically actively acting against the interests of the people making these models, right? There's a reason why they're behind, paid APIs and all of that. And it's actually also a question I always have for people working in interpretability. It just came up yesterday a little bit, whose interests are represented in what way in, the idea to make things more legible in that sense. But, that's not directly responding to your comment. I realize that, but I think there's much to be said about, the let's say, new shapes of critique, maybe, that we need to produce in the face of also with how like the, invisible features that are thrown at us that, we can read, but that still definitely represent the real world in a certain sense. So.
Thank you for both of the presentations. I was thinking about the gap between the conclusions that both of you presented and having this feeling that, both sets of observations are true. And yet, the gap between what you're working with is very apparent. And I was thinking more about the gap as this productive space for theory. And so my question is really for the second presenter. Las Meninas really struck me as this example. Maybe I'm taking it out of the seriation that you gave us, this nice triptych in a way. But it's almost as if there's a gap between the representational and the perceptual. So if you ask the program to reproduce the image, it fails radically. It can't do it. But when you ask the program to search and find, we know that it's much better at doing that. And it gets closer to that perceptual dimension, which then in a way almost becomes a representation of self-reflexivity. And so I guess I wanted to hear you, Fabian, say more about maybe Benjamin's essay on art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and whether that provides us. I don't know if this is a gap you see between sort of the representational and the perceptual. It strikes me that machine learning will, of course, close that gap, right? So the gap might be also precious to this particular moment in terms of how we think about the work of critical theory. But I have no doubt that DALL-E or any of these programs at some point will narrow that gap very radically, right? And in that sense, will be considered successful. But I guess I wanted to hear more about maybe that space of the gap, whether you see it and how we could work with it at this moment.
Thank you. I really love that question. But it's hard to answer also, which, good questions usually are. When I think about, the notion of the gap, let me say in the context of this particular research, right? I'm thinking about, that I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that these search operations necessarily give you a hierarchy of results, but never an exact result, right? So it's a high dimensional space full of points that represent certain things. But you'll never get this one single result. You're always only encircling kind of the best possible result. It's the same with or it's even worse actually, or more pronounced in word embeddings, where you just embed text basically in a space, and then you're looking for a solution, let's say, to an analogy question or something like that. And there's going to be a solution, but the solution is made up from the first 10 results or something like that, because there's no exact solution. So in a sense, all these systems operate on gaps already and necessarily. And I think it's really interesting that the fact that the retrieval approach works kind of better. I think one reason is that we give it access to actual artistically valid, aesthetically valid material, right? So the reason why we get a result that's better is because there's new stuff that's being introduced, and there's an opportunity almost, right, to get closer to some of the motifs that we're looking for. This is super vague, yeah, and there's another dimension, just very briefly, right, where I have the gap related to the question of the glitch. This is especially, I think, relevant for stuff like AI art, which was really interesting for a while, I would say, between 2014 and 2020, but really is not that interesting anymore, just because, the models are so perfect and, can get these photorealistic results. And it's all just, stacking semantics, basically. So in a sense, as long as we have a gap, maybe there's more opportunities for a kind of humanist or maybe even aesthetic access to analyzing these systems. Sorry, that was a very convoluted way of saying that. I really like the question and I have to think more about it.
With the question to the first speaker, this is a bit too loud. But anyway, your talk on feature extraction was incredibly stimulating, and I was thinking of I'm sure machine learning researchers in the space will not sort of let me lie, but data repurposing is super common, right? So as far as I'm aware, there's some researcher who has this data, they published it, and then you have your own project, and then you use the data from that available source, and then you combine it with your project and so on. So I was thinking, the problem seems to be, at least in my view, that not necessarily feature extraction, but data collection itself. Because I'm imagining this yoga example is super stimulating, because in some context, it could be neutral data collection. But then if I combine it with some other thing, it becomes racialized, right? So any attempt at collecting data, depending on the context, could actually be racialized, to use the term. I don't know if that's something you mentioned in the paper, or something that it seems to be relevant. And I don't know if what I'm saying is accurate, especially from the machine learning side, but I definitely know that data repurposing is pretty common.
Yes, thank you. I suppose a part of my paper is there is so much work done on the politics of data sets. And a part of the project of my paper is actually to move a little bit away from that, or not away, but just to say there is great work being done there. And I think but there's also more work to be done on how models themselves are doing a form of like novel racialization, particularly in the context in which like, I mean, this interesting concept of history, it's like historical data, but when data is like constantly being generated, the lines of history are like much more compressed than we would have thought. I mean, Oscar Gandy Jr. like has a brilliant sort of interview where he's like, forget history, seriously forget it, because like the forms of racist history that you're thinking about, even when you like incorporate them into these new models, it's producing a different kind of order. An order of racism that is sort of like not necessarily ideological, but, you know, like racism is being produced not necessarily ideologically, as in that is to say with like a clear regime as to like, you know, I don't like these kind of people, or like it's a eugenic regime where it's like around trying to like breed super mentions or whatever, but it's doing it statistically, which is a different order of it. Like it's like race is, it's like a complete ontological flatness to data points, which still nevertheless produces a racial order. That is like a fascinating thing to me, which has less to do with the data set and more to do with the process.
Yeah. Those are both so great. Well, they were. Yeah. Oh, it goes without saying. Whatever. Okay, sorry. But this is sorry. That's a promising start. Sorry. Sorry. I guess question. I guess sort of thinking, with both these papers, you know, there's sort of questions of bringing to light, you know, representation, and questions of grounding. You know, like these are sort of classic kind of metaphors and modes of thinking in you know, in phenomenology. The question I'm thinking for Fabian, I don't know how to express this properly, you know, but like the one thing I'm thinking is like foundation models, right? You know, it's a metaphor of grounding, you know, and there's sort of like, there's a kind of fantasy of the earth sprung, you know, like, and like, the thing I'm thinking of, you know, it's like you're discussing this in terms of, you know, Foucauldian, you know, sort of schema of mathesis and so forth, you know, and analyzing this for Benjamin, I'm wondering, you know, like, does this sort of idea of foundational models, I mean, is it the expression of a particular sort of romantic intuition, you know, maybe in the kind of like German sense? And I'm wondering, is there even like a kind of like genealogy of the reception, you know, like it's almost kind of operational image of a particular phenomenology, you know, and I'm thinking the way like Heidegger himself is kind of taken up by like Dreyfus or whatever in like computer-human interaction, you know, like, is this like, you know, it's not like a kind of arbitrary decision, or like Benjamin himself is the kind of like hermeneutic kind of frame, you know, it's not like just, you know, like, you know, Benjamin and Heidegger are so close in so many ways, you know, in like dangerous ways. This is what I'm thinking. I don't know. Is Stanford, you know, like the foundational model, you know, is it like a kind of like, you know, this like particular kind of like, yeah, sort of phenomenological intuition at play that you're kind of engaging with and kind of sketching out? That's kind of crazy, you know, but like, I don't know, like, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe a couple of brief thoughts, but I think there's two things you're asking. If I got you right, that, you know, on the one hand, the question of foundation models. I mean, this is a clearly ideological term, right? This is manufactured to sell you the utopia of GPT-3 running society, right? I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean, right? So, of course, you could, you know, go ahead and really look at it as, you know, it may be more ontological, in a more ontological framework, and think about, you know, what is really the base of these models. You know, you could, you know, go, you know, the Killerian route and say, okay, yeah, actually it doesn't really matter because we're running on, you know, giant GPU clusters. Let's look at those and not at the, you know, intricacies of specific models and stuff like that. That's one thing. But I'm not sure if there's more there. The other thing, you know, you mentioned a bunch of theory and the fact that, you know, Heidegger at some point in the distant past was somewhat popular for 5 people in computer science, more or less, right? And of course, we all wish that would happen again in a sense, but I think the question really is, don't we need like, and I use Benjamin here for a reason, but maybe we also need some new theory, right? Maybe the tools and methods that we get from Benjamin, Foucault, Heidegger, and what have you are not good enough anymore to talk about these really almost post-symbolic structures, right? Where on the one hand, nothing is legible. It's all just like compressed and garbled. And on the other hand, especially for large language models, suddenly everything is legible. Everything is expressed in terms of natural language, right? Coding, suddenly natural language. It's the opposite usually of natural language. But suddenly, it's GPT-3 to give you suggestions how to program. You use it, for whatever, protein folding. It's all language suddenly. So I think these categories are just like shifting, and there's a, I think, necessary search that we as humans have to do for the right ways to talk about this. Yeah.
Very nice provocation to end on. Can we thank our speakers for great talk and a great discussion from everyone? Okay, that's like the end of our formal presentations, but as we